Greetings from Germany. This is Ike, speaking for the sake of the Son of Man, to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. In the last video, I unraveled the mysteries as to why God put the two trees in the Garden of Eden, and why they were trees, and not something else, like treasuries, for example. In that context, I have further elaborated on the whole duality principle that forms the basis of our reality, and how God intentionally allowed it to be this way. We have also looked at the analogy between the Genesis account and the words of Christ, who later spoke of good and bad trees and good and bad fruits in relation to people and their actions. This time I want to focus on what actually happened in the Garden of Eden, beyond the obvious. There are some hidden truths in the story of the Great Fall that not few Christians are unaware of. The Father wants his children to know these things because they are important. So let's get to it and shed some light on the whole thing. Remember, God had just made human beings in his image and given them a paradise-like place to live on earth. In that place there were also the two trees that God had put there, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As we all know, God warned them, "You may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die." I have explained to you already in the last video that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a tree of death and therefore makes a dualistic pair with the tree of life. It is important to keep in mind that humans were allowed to live forever and were not destined to die according to God's intention when he created us. God put the tree of life in the place where he put the first human beings, as we read in the Bible, and he allowed them to eat from it as much and as often as they liked, because he wanted them to live forever. He never had in mind that humans should die. That is why they had unlimited access to the tree of life. Humans have been made in the image of God, as we read in the Bible, and God himself is the ultimate universal eternal spiritual being, who is, who was, and who will always be, the Alpha and the Omega. Since God is eternal, and human beings were made in God's image, they are eternal as well. At the latest, when you look at how God created man in his image, and how he allowed to eat unlimitedly from the tree of life, you should realize that humans have an eternal soul. But eternal is not the same as immortal, as we are going to see in a moment. So God warned them not to eat from the tree of death, because God obviously knew something that humans did not know at the time. Although they had been made in the image of God, they lacked this one aspect, this one quality, this one ability, if you will. The knowledge of what good or right means, and what evil or bad or wrong means, and everything related to that knowledge. That is, what dying means, what sickness means, what starvation means, what being hated feels like, what being oppressed feels like, what toil and struggle means, what pain and suffering feels like, what sadness feels like, what depression and anxiety feels like, what competition means, and much more. Or generally spoken, what forsakenness, separation from God feels like. Because that is precisely what the knowledge of evil entails. Humans already had the knowledge of good, but they had nothing to compare it to, and therefore were not aware of their knowledge of good. In order to understand and know what good meant, they had to experience what bad or wrong or evil meant, so that they could compare those experiences with the experiences of goodness, and thereby define what good and what evil meant to them, and learn to differentiate between the two. It's a real tragedy, as you can see. This is where you have to ask the question, do you really need to know what hatred feels like in order to know what love feels like? Do you need to experience death in order to know what life means and to experience life? We have arrived once again at the phenomenon of duality. If you think you need hatred to experience love, and that you need death to experience life, you are deceived by the greatest deceiver the universe has ever known. This is the greatest lie ever. And that is why I already gave a hint in one of my earlier videos that cultures or religions who worship duality as it is, or even attempt to bring both aspects into harmony, to reconcile them, make the two into one, don't know what they are doing, and don't seem to understand the consequences of that. They want to experience life, truth, wisdom, and all the things they define as being good. But they are keeping death and evil and all the things they define as being bad alive as well by worshipping duality, and therefore they are separating themselves from the Father of all, who is non-dualistic. There is no darkness in him. There is no lie in him. There is no death in him. See? That's actually in the Bible. God himself is non-dualistic. He is monistic. He just set up this reality that we live in as a dualistic reality. The worship of the knowledge of duality, good and evil, right and wrong, brings death. Just as God said, if you eat the fruit of the knowledge of duality, good and evil, you are sure to die, if you believe it or not. But God knew something. That is why he warned us. I have explained to you in one of my earlier videos that the dualistic aspects always coexist. That is not the problem. The problem has to do with conscious beings knowing and manifesting duality. It is important to understand that both do not have to manifest themselves. One quality can manifest without the other manifesting. The other quality only has to exist as a potential possibility. It's a matter of choice, a matter of consciousness that manifests the one or the other or both. We are made in God's image, and so we can choose, like God can choose. Some manifestations in the universe are already determined by God's will, by his choices, and these choices are not allowed to be made by humans. But some we are completely free to choose, like being good or being evil, for example, telling the truth or telling the lie, loving somebody or hating somebody. So let's take a closer look now at what really happened to the first human beings when they gained the knowledge of duality, or good and evil. They obviously did not know what good and evil meant before they ate the forbidden fruit. So they did not know that they were doing something evil when they ate the forbidden fruit, because at that time they still lacked the knowledge about what evil even is. Let's just use the word bad instead of evil for a second. So God obviously couldn't and did not judge them for doing something bad, since they didn't even know that eating from the forbidden tree was bad. They had no knowledge about what bad or wrong or evil even meant. What they obviously did know was what obedience is, what trust means, since they replied to Satan that God had forbidden them to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They obviously also knew what death meant, since they argued that God had said they would have to die if they would eat from that tree, and therefore they originally did not want to eat from it. So they already had knowledge about God's authority, and that what God said was to be obeyed. They knew at least that they should not do what God had forbidden them to do, and they also knew what life and death meant. So in some aspects they had knowledge about duality, in some aspects, but they had not yet experienced that knowledge. Although they had not experienced death up to that point, they obviously were able to imagine what it meant. So that kind of knowledge they already had. But as I said, they did not yet know that it could or would be evil to be disobedient towards their Creator, who, when he had forbidden to eat from that tree, really just had the best in mind for them. They did not understand that, because they did not even have the knowledge of what good actually means, neither what good nor what evil meant. So they were really judged and punished for their disobedience, for their unfaithfulness, mistrusting God, and not for deliberately doing something evil, because they could not do something evil without even knowing that it was evil. But right in the moment they had eaten the forbidden fruit, they suddenly had the knowledge of good and evil. And right in that moment they also understood that what they had just done was not only an act of disobedience, of unfaithfulness, but that it was also evil. Now suddenly they felt ashamed of themselves because they could see what they had done. And what they also could see with the knowledge of good and evil now was that when God had forbidden them to eat from that tree, He actually had the best in mind for them. Now they could see that God was good and they were evil because they had assumed that God was evil in the way that He deliberately had forbidden them to gain that knowledge so that they could not become like God themselves. Their thoughts were evil because they had accused a benevolent God of deliberately withholding something from them that God possessed and obviously did not want to share with them. Do you know what we call such a behavior, such an intention of the heart nowadays, that we have a word for it? Greed. The first human beings that God had created were greedy. They lived in a perfect paradise, could eat from the tree of life as often and as much as they liked and live forever. And they had all you need to be happy, to enjoy your existence, and yet it was not enough. They wanted more. They wanted to have that one thing that God had, and they had not. Why? Everything was perfect in God's eyes, and there was nothing else that Adam and Eve needed in order to live forever in utmost joy. But they were greedy. They thought, why can God have this mysterious knowledge of good and evil and we can't? That's unfair. We want that too. What is the point of being content and happy for all eternity with what we have, if God has more than we do? If there's more, we want more. We don't want to be inferior to the Creator who made us and the paradise we live in. We want all that He has. Do you see what's going on here? They had all that God had except for this one thing that God had warned them about because He had the best in mind for them. And He knew that it would cause suffering, destruction and death in His creation when anyone else except Him had that knowledge too. And what happened? Precisely that. Suffering, destruction and death, up to this very day. God is the only one who can handle the knowledge of good and evil and never misuse it for selfish desires, doing evil or causing suffering and destruction. That is why I said in one of my earlier videos that man can never be like God as long as he possesses the knowledge of good and evil. The greatest lie ever was that Satan claimed that humans will be like God when they gain the knowledge of good and evil. No, they are like Satan with that knowledge. They use it for selfish purposes and cause a lot of suffering and destruction with that knowledge. Satan himself cannot handle that knowledge at all. He is even worse than Adam and Eve, because he has been given much more power, and he can use it to influence our reality in a very negative way. Therefore, God had to limit Satan's time in which he is allowed to affect all creation. Ultimately, the universe, all creation, will always have to be governed by God, because no one can properly handle the knowledge of good and evil unless he relies on God's guidance. God must define what is good and what is evil, not Satan and not man. I will explain this in more detail in the next video. So, what happened in the Garden of Eden? Let's briefly summarize what we have learned so far. Humans proved that they are not like God because they are greedy. They wanted more. They were jealous of their own Creator because He had one thing they did not have. By disobeying God's commandment and mistrusting Him, they accused God of being evil for withholding that one thing from them that they thought would make them like God. In reality, He didn't withhold anything from them, because after all, He didn't prevent them from gaining the knowledge of good and evil. He had only warned them not to reach for it. The moment they did reach for it, evil manifested in our reality and paved the way for egotism, diseases, war, violence, murder, hatred, suffering, anxiety, sadness, depression, pain, chaos, and such like. And of course, one of the greatest consequences was that now there was death. Now let's start to take a closer look at the character of Satan. Which role did he play in all of this? Well, I'm afraid I have to repeat myself, but we are once again confronted with duality when we look at the character of Satan, the serpent, the devil, and Lucifer. God disapproved of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan advocated eating from the tree. There you have your dualistic pair again. Two opposing characters with two opposing motives. God really had the best in mind for humans when he warned them not to gain that knowledge, because he did not want humans to die and to experience evil, suffering, and all that negative stuff. Satan, on the other hand, had only evil in mind for them. He wanted to see mankind's downfall. He wanted to see us destroy God's creation and his order, because he knew that we could not handle the knowledge of good and evil without bad consequences. Just as Satan cannot handle this knowledge at all without misusing it for selfish purposes and causing destruction. God wanted to protect us. He is the altruist. Satan wanted us to become like him and worship him as our great illuminator. So he is the egotist. God told the truth. Satan told the lie. There you have your duality once again in every aspect. It must be this way. If you consider yourself to be a follower of Yeshua, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, God in the flesh, and you believe that the Bible is inspired by God's Spirit, then you should become aware of the things I have just explained to you, and that I am going to explain to you in the future. This is how everything functions in this creation, and therefore Satan's fingerprint is everywhere. God provided the possibility for a dualistic experience. Satan then made us worship duality and become slaves of it. But remember, just because it is this way does not mean that you cannot choose one or the other. You don't have to hold on to duality. You don't have to be its slave forever. Let me read John 8, verse 34 to you. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave of sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. So if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. I hope you believe in Christ, because he is the only way to be freed from that slavery. If you believe in Christ and his message, you will also have to flee from duality, even if it is omnipresent. In your mind, you can still flee from it. So again, Satan had to be in that garden. People always ask, why would a benevolent God allow a character like Satan to be in his creation? I have just given you the answer. And it is the same answer I have given you in my second video, where I spoke about God letting darkness exist in the beginning of creation, so that it may serve a purpose. God is light, so he could have removed all darkness from creation. He could have removed Satan right in the beginning, but he didn't. Does that make him evil? No, quite the opposite. Adam and Eve, the first human beings, did not have to listen to Satan and give in to temptation. Of course not. Just because the dualistic opposite is available as a possibility does not mean that it has to manifest itself perceivably. It won't do so until you as a conscious being with free will choose to allow it to enter our reality. I'm not saying your reality because this is a collective consciousness thing and it affects our reality that we all experience here on Earth. Mankind as a whole is responsible for it. Adam and Eve had the choice to ignore Satan's words and the tree of knowledge, but they didn't. They were mankind at the time. There were no other decision makers, because God had left this realm of duality completely to human beings. Genesis 1 verse 28, this is one of God's commandments, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over everything. This is why he didn't constantly intervene and prevent bad things from happening. The Great Flood was one of those exceptional cases where there simply was no other option. But overall, God had intended the earthly realm to be the domain of man, as we've just read in Genesis 1 verse 28. Therefore, God had to leave darkness, Satan, the tree of death, and all these things available in his creation, in order for you and me to have the experience of free will, and not feel like a robot, like a machine. Of course, we see how dangerous free will can be when it is in the hands of a selfish being. Man is a pretty selfish creature and has a destructive nature, as we have learned throughout our history. But we want our free will nonetheless. And God knows that. He is not a tyrannical creator. He leaves us with free will. There is no free will without an alternative being available. And God just made that alternative available for us. He made his creation the way he considers it to be perfect. But if we don't like that, we can destroy God's order and come up with our own. That is why you have the two trees in the garden. and why you have God and Satan. Worship God as God or worship Satan as God, that is yourself. You choose. It's all about duality. Good fruit, bad fruit. Truth, lies. Life, death. Light, darkness. Heaven and hell. So what I've just tried to explain is that Satan actually plays the role of the antagonist of our Creator. He is the personification of the power in our universe that is opposed to God. That is why he is called the Prince of Darkness. God is light and there is no darkness in him. Where does the darkness come from then? Well, not from God. From the opposing side. Well, Satan is just the personification of that side. He's a liar and a deceiver because God is truth. See, if God were dualistic, there would be light and darkness in him. He would be good and evil at the same time. Everything would be united in him. Then it would make sense to worship duality, in a way, like many ancient cultures used to do, and some still do today, with their yin and their yang and their black and white symbolism. But God is not two in one. The Bible clearly gives plenty of evidence that God is monistic. Those ancient cultures have been worshipping Satan. He uses duality as a means to deceive people and hide his true intentions. He comes in the alleged light of knowledge. But in truth he brings darkness, evil, suffering, destruction and death. That is a trick. He comes in the name of the one who brings light, Lucifer, the light bearer, who enlightens us. Prometheus, Greek mythology, the same one, brings fire to mankind to enlighten them. Then their eyes were opened. Genesis 3 verse 7. Wow, we are enlightened now. Satan is a good guy. He only wants to help us reach our full potential and become enlightened masters of ourselves. He helps us to become gods ourselves. He helps us to achieve self-empowerment. He gave us wisdom and secret knowledge because he had the best in mind for us and did not want us to be merely slaves of our Creator. And he actually told the truth when he said to Eve, "You will not die." God actually lied because he said that Adam and Eve would surely die if they gained the knowledge of good and evil. But obviously they didn't die immediately after they had eaten the forbidden fruit. So God must have lied, and Satan is actually the good guy because he had actually told the truth. Yeah, forget it. What a delusional misconception. Of course I died, and that is the reason why every human being on this earth must die. Where did death originally come from? The knowledge of duality, of course, because it separates us from God, who is life. No God, no life. Satan cannot give life. He can only take it, destroy it, because he is the dualistic opposite of God. That is his role, and this is a law. He can never change. He must fulfill this purpose. When God told Adam and Eve that they would surely have to die, he spoke of the process of dying, not that they would drop dead immediately, right in that moment. The death he is speaking of is not only implying the process of dying physically in the form that our bodies age and decay, it is also implying something much more serious, and that is the conscious dying process of the soul, which is eternal. When God is speaking of death, he means consciously experiencing the opposite of life. God sees life and death differently than most humans do. If life means to exist as an eternal conscious being that is sin-free, healthy, full of light, bearing good fruit, experiencing only love, joy, compassion, truth, wisdom, peace, harmony, and such like, then death means to exist as an eternal conscious being that experiences the opposites of all the qualities that define life in God's eyes. This is why death, according to God's definition, can be summarized as an eternal state of torment and suffering. I just wanted to clarify this in case that someone who believes that Satan told the truth and God told the lie is watching this video. God did not lie, believe me. So let's continue with Satan. Satan is a master at deception and hiding his true intention, by appearing as the great supporter of mankind, the one who brings enlightenment, which we believe helps us reach our full potential. That's a lie. Satan could even deceive followers of Christ back in time, through Gnosticism, for example. Let me read this to you from the Gospel of Thomas. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside as the outside, and the outside as the inside, and the upper as the lower, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female not female, and when you make eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you shall enter the kingdom of heaven. This is actually what Jesus is supposed to have said. Now you know why we have arrived at a point in time where you can freely choose your gender. You have also seen two buildings come down and being replaced by one. They want to make the two into one. And they are probably believing that they are doing God's will, the will of the great architect of the universe. Unfortunately, what happens is that the two dualistic sides get confused, and evil becomes good, and good becomes evil. Light becomes darkness, and darkness becomes light. You cannot make the two into one in this fashion, and God never told us to do so. This is Isaiah 5, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. What does light have to do with darkness? Nothing. Yeshua said, you cannot serve God and the mammon at the same time. You also cannot be full of light and be full of darkness at the same time. Worshipping the triptych principle, you being the master in the middle, who is balancing the two opposing sides and uniting them within you. All of that comes from Satan. From what we learn through the Bible, we know that making the two into one, twisting the two, playing around with duality, is against God's will. But didn't Jesus say, on earth as it is in heaven? Isn't that the same as above, so below? Making the two into one? No. Christ speaks about the desire for our reality to be replaced by God's reality. That is like having light and darkness and getting rid of the darkness, replacing it with light, or having good and evil and getting rid of evil by replacing it with good. Do you see how this is not the same as uniting the two or balancing the two? I mean, it's obvious. The Bible says that Satan wants to be God. He wants to be worshipped by all creation. That means that this force, this power in our universe wants to take over. This is a spiritual thing. The Bible calls this the great war in heaven. Heaven meaning in this case the spiritual dimension of our universe. And this is also the battle over your mind that I've spoken of in one of my earlier videos, where I said that the battle is heating up and Satan's time is getting short now, and that you need to take heed, that you do not get deceived. Satan comes in the name of unity, making all into one. Good and evil, male and female, truth and lies, light and darkness. Satan has had a lot of time here on earth to influence our reality and manipulate and even destroy God's order. Now, since this realm is dualistic and Satan is part of that system, you probably already know by now what that implies. Just as it is written in the Bible. Satan will lose his dominion at a certain point in time, and God will take over again. There you have the duality principle again. First, Satan and man rule over earth, and have their will be done for a while. Then God takes over, and lets us experience what his reign looks like. But remember that only those who he has brought into communion with himself through his Son, those who know the Son and believe in him being the way and the truth and the life, will experience God's reign on earth. The Son of Man who has disempowered duality and thus death, and who has overcome this world, this dualistic reality. Let me repeat John 8 verse 34 one more time here. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave of sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. So if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. We all have sinned, because we are all slaves of our knowledge of duality, the knowledge of good and evil. Everyone is born with it. No one can deny that knowledge, and so everyone is responsible for their choices. And if they have made only even one evil choice in their life, they have already lost the connection with the source of life, that is God, in whom there is no evil and will never be. We have all done that. Believing in Christ is the only way to reconnect with our Creator and become part of His family. That is why Christ spoke of Himself as being part of the family forever. Only through our personal relationship with Christ, our genuine faith in Him, we are cleansed from all that is evil and ungodly in us, and can recover our connection to God, our Creator, and the source of the life that we have been given. Then we will live and not die, because there is no death in God and in all who are one with God. Now, because Satan has been reigning since the fall of man, he has had already too much time to reign over the earthly realm, if you ask me. So expect God to take over in the not too distant future. We have seen that Christ began to build the kingdom of God here on earth quite some time ago. And He will of course bring it to completion in the future, as it is written. This will not only happen because of the prophecies, but also because of the law of duality. The universal force that we see in the personification of Satan, the devil, the deceiver, Lucifer, will lose its right to influence our reality for a good amount of time. This is where we are going to experience only God's will be done on earth, and where Christ is going to reign over every aspect of our reality. With this good news, I would like to close this video. I'm going to further explain the problem of the knowledge of good and evil in the next video, where we are going to take a look at why God had to guard the tree of life because of that, and why God must define what is evil and what is good, and not Satan nor man. And maybe, if time allows, we will already analyze God's reaction to the whole incident, and the way our human ancestors behaved in that situation, and what we can learn from it. I hope to see you in the next video. Be blessed.